All right.
All right. Sweet.
Get rolling. Um, all right. So this week we're talking about the moral argument for the existence of God. And yeah, thumbs up. um, so the last few weeks, what we've been working through again is just the different arguments for the existence of God. We've talked about the cosmological argument. That's basically pointing out that everything that has a beginning has to have something that started it. Then we talked about the teleological argument, which is looking at basically design and saying that the universe, especially, has a very complex and precise design. And anything that has that sort of complex design needs to have something that designed it. And so now what we're going to get into is the moral argument. There's a lot of other arguments. We even touched very shortly last week on the ontological argument. There's a lot of other arguments that we could still make, but we're hitting these three specifically just because these are the ones that people are going to find most convincing when you're out in everyday life talking with people. These are the ones that you're probably not going to have to do a lot of digging. These are ones that people are going to intuitively kind of grasp and understand very, very well in order for it to be something that's convincing to them. So today we're talking about the moral argument, which I think is one of the best arguments to make, because I think this is one that majority of people, whether they're scientific or not, are just intuitively understanding that there is moral rights and wrongs, and therefore we need to have some sort of explanation of that. And so with that, we're going to dive into this and show that ultimately, if there is this kind of moral law or code, or however you want to call it, the best explanation of that is that God exists. Any other explanation falls short in different ways. So to start off, I want to just kind of put the argument out there. And again, what we're looking at is we're looking at what we say in logic is a valid argument. So that means we're going to look at each of these premises, knowing and understanding what these premises say. If they are true, then the conclusion has to follow from it. That's what a valid argument means. Now, that doesn't mean that those premises are actually true. It just means that if they are true, the conclusion must follow. And so if someone is going to argue against this, they can't just simply say, oh, I don't think your argument works. They have to now say, this is why I think one of your premises is false, because the argument itself is valid. So when we're talking about the moral argument, the first premise we're going to say is that without God, objective moral values and duties don't exist. So that's premise number one. Premise number two is objective moral values and duties do exist. And then conclusion then is that God does exist. So we'll explain this a lot more in depth, but I want to put out some kind of clarifications as we go through first, just to make sure. A lot of times this is one of those arguments that people will misunderstand. And you'll see at the end of today that even some of the best atheists, the top atheists and most popular atheists out there, misunderstand what this argument is saying, to think that it's claiming things that it's not. And they'll argue against that. They'll straw man the argument because they're not understanding what it's really saying. So we're going to first make some clarifications. And the first clarification is that we're not claiming that the person who does not believe in God cannot know right or wrong. So with the atheist who doesn't believe in God, I'm not saying that they cannot be moral or they cannot know what's right and wrong. What I'm saying is that they can't have a foundation for it. Our claim is not that one cannot be moral without belief in God, but that there is no grounding for objective morality without God. So you could look at it, and this is an analogy that I've used. I'm not sure how great it really is, but somebody could build a house without putting it on a good, firm foundation, or they could build a house on a firm foundation, but without kind of realizing they did that. Now, the house is going to fall apart if it's not on a good, firm foundation. But you being able to build the house isn't prefaced on your ability and knowledge to know that it is on a firm foundation. You might have the knowledge and the know-how to build the house correctly, even though you don't understand the foundation that you're building it on. And that's kind of what we're saying when we're looking at this from an atheist perspective. It doesn't matter whether the atheist believes in God or not. They can still come to an understanding of morality, and they can still be good, moral people, even if they don't believe in God. But if God just doesn't exist, if the rock that you build the house on just doesn't exist, then the house itself is going to fall apart. And so that's what we're saying with this argument, is not that the atheist can't be moral or the atheist can't know what morals are. What we're saying is the atheist doesn't have a actual foundation. The atheist worldview, if God doesn't exist, there is no foundation for morality to sit on. And so morality will fall apart. It cannot be objective without God. So kind of looking at it like this, if this house stayed in this sort of state where it's propped up, builders know that sitting like that, this house is eventually going to fall apart. It's built really well. It's a beautiful home, but without it actually being on a firm foundation, even though the house is even built well from a builder's perspective, it will fall apart because it needs to be placed on a firm foundation. Second clarification. We're not saying that there's agreement on what that standard is. So I can say that there is objective morality, even if I don't know or can't point out exactly what the moral choice is in any and every situation. So I know there's objective answers to mathematical problems, but if I don't know the answer to a mathematical problem, that doesn't suddenly mean that it's subjective. That the answer could be multiple things. There's still only one correct or right answer to a mathematical problem, even if the best mathematicians in the world don't know what the answer is. So subjectivity doesn't come out just because there's disagreement or lack of understanding. So we see that when we look at other things. Disagreement in science doesn't work like that. You wouldn't say that when we didn't understand the Big Bang, that maybe the Big Bang never happened, or that when we didn't understand gravity, that maybe gravity exists for some people who believed that was the answer, and it did exist for some people, and that it didn't exist for other people. It didn't matter what people believed about those scientific truths. Those scientific truths remain what they were despite lack of understanding or even disagreement on the topic. The same thing goes with logic. And so it then makes sense when we're talking about morality. What we're saying is there is an objective morality out there when it comes to then getting in the nitty-gritty of different circumstances and deciding which ones are true and which ones, or which objective moral duties and objectives are what we should do. That doesn't, us not being able to come to a conclusion in that doesn't mean that there isn't an objective answer to those questions. Another clarification is that this doesn't mean that there's one moral command that trumps all other commands or all other moral duties or objectives. So we wouldn't look at it and say that in every circumstance, because objective morality exists and objective morality says it's not good to lie, that means in any circumstance, you shouldn't lie. That's what objective morality would mean. That's not what objective morality means. It means that given any specific situation, there would be a specific thing that would need to be done that is the best thing, that is objectively the right and moral thing to do. It doesn't mean that lying in any and every circumstance is what you should do. So we give the example of if you were housing Jews in your house and Nazis came knocking at your door, obviously wanting to take the Jews and kill them. When we think of one of those objective things in morality, we would say that lying isn't something you should do. You should tell the truth. But in that circumstance, I'm not denying moral objectivity by saying in that circumstance, it's better for you to lie. It is the moral thing for you to lie, even though in general, I would be saying you shouldn't lie. That doesn't go against moral ideas. And this is how we see even things like chess work. In general, you would say it's not good to give up your queen when you're playing chess. That's just not a good move in general. Logically speaking, It's a very logical game. There's very clear, this is the best things to be doing in a game of chess. And pretty much every circumstance, it's going to be the best thing not to give up your queen. But there is examples where you would say it is best in this situation and strategic and logical for me actually to give up my queen in this situation. And so it's better for me to do that. Same thing goes with music. We think of music when you're looking at a music sheet. One note isn't the note that should always be played. At certain times, a certain note is the right note to play. But that note in another circumstance isn't the right note to play because it's in the wrong key or the wrong pitch or whatever else like that. And so what we're understanding is, yes, there's objective things when we're talking about morality, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't change no matter what the situation or moment. It does change in different situations or moments, but that doesn't go against the objectivity of it. So to clarify in some ways, another couple of things that we need to be pointing out is can there be a difference between being right and wrong with the absence of God? So what we're asking is there any way to objectively say that there is a right and wrong in any given situation if God doesn't exist? That's what we're asking. And we would ultimately be saying, no, there isn't. If God doesn't exist, there is no way to objectively say there's a right and wrong in a situation. So, or you could also think of what is the foundation of morality? What is the bedrock? What is that main part that everything else rides upon? And can that foundation be anything other than God? That's what we're kind of asking with all of this. So a way to kind of intuitively, when we're talking with people, help them kind of grasp where we're going with this and make sure that they just grasp it really, really easily and quickly is we all know that there's moral rights and wrongs. This is something I think we intuitively all look at. And a great example is everything that's happening in our society right now. There's this outcry against police brutality, against racism that's going on because we look at it and we say there is a moral right and a moral wrong. And there's moral wrongs that are being done right now that need to stop. And so we know that there's that moral right and wrong. And we also know that we don't always obey that. So that's a little different than a lot of the other laws we might talk about. So we might talk about the law of gravity. But with the law of gravity, the rock doesn't have this thought when you let go of it of, oh, well, I have the choice of either obeying the law of gravity right now, or I can choose not to obey it. That is a law that there's no choice to it whatsoever. Every object is forced to obey that law. And so this is different than some of the other laws that we might talk about when we're just talking about logic and knowledge and understanding, in the sense that we're given the choice and the ability to reject what we know we should do in given situations. But we also know that whatever this law is, wherever it comes from, it can't be coming from us, because when we're saying it's objective, we're saying that it cannot be something that changes based upon how you or I think or feel. And so that moral law or code or whatever we want to call it again, must be something that is not created by man, but it's something that's discovered by man. And so therefore, if it was, and the reasons for that, very simply, and we'll talk about this more, is if it was created by man, it could have been different. So in the situation of the Nazis knocking on your door and asking for the Jews that you're hiding, it could have been that humanity decided, yes, lying is always wrong, no matter what the circumstance. We could have, as humanity, just decided that. And in that situation would mean I need to give up the Jews to the Nazis and let them be killed. It could have been that way. But we intuitively understand that doesn't make sense. We would say that we cannot change that. And then in the end, that would make it, of course, subjective. That it maybe even person to person gets to decide, well, maybe I do think it's morally right to give up the Jews. Maybe I don't think it's right to give up the Jews in that situation. So it's got to be something that's outside of humanity. It's got to be something that is beyond that. So again, our argument is without God, there's no universal moral law. There is a universal law, so God exists. So again, I'm going to show you, this is William Lane Craig kind of illustrated it out in a video to kind of help us grasp it really easily.
Good and bad, right and wrong do exist, just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real. Our moral experience
that somehow started like in the middle of it. Let's start
Can
this
you
over.
be good without God? Let's find out. Absolutely astounding. There you have it. Undeniable proof that you can be good without believing in God. But wait, the question isn't, can you be good without believing in God? The question is, can you be good without God? See, here's the problem. If there is no God, what basis remains for objective good or bad, right or wrong? If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. And here's why. Without some objective reference point, we have no way of saying that something is really up or down. God's nature provides an objective reference point for moral values. It's the standard against which all actions and decisions are measured. But if there's no God, there's no objective reference point. All we're left with is one person's viewpoint, which is no more valid than anyone else's viewpoint. This kind of morality is subjective, not objective. It's like a preference for strawberry ice cream. The preference is in the subject, not the object. So it doesn't apply to other people. In the same way, subjective morality applies only to the subject. It's not valid or binding for anyone else. So, in a world without God, there can be no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. God has expressed his moral nature to us as commands. These provide the basis for moral duties. For example, God's essential attribute of love is expressed in his command to love your neighbor as yourself. This command provides a foundation on which we can affirm the objective goodness of generosity, self-sacrifice, and equality. And we can condemn as objectively evil greed, abuse, and discrimination. This raises a problem. Is something good just because God wills it, or does God will something because it is good? The answer is neither one. Rather, God wills something because he is good. God is the standard of moral values, just as a live musical performance is the standard for a high-fidelity recording.
Without your love.
The more a recording sounds like the original, the better it is. Likewise, the more closely a moral action conforms to God's nature, the better it is. But if atheism is true, there is no ultimate standard. So there can be no moral obligations or duties. Who or what lays such duties upon us? No one. Remember, for the atheist, humans are just accidents of nature, highly evolved animals. But animals have no moral obligations to one another. When a cat kills a mouse, it hasn't done anything morally wrong. The cat's just being a cat. If God doesn't exist, we should view human behavior in the same way. No action should be considered morally right or wrong. But the problem is, good and bad, right and wrong do exist. Just as our sense experience convinces us that the physical world is objectively real, our moral experience convinces us that moral values are objectively real. Every time you say, hey, that's not fair, that's wrong, that's an injustice, you affirm your belief in the existence of objective morals. We're well aware that child abuse, racial discrimination, and terrorism are wrong for everybody, always. Is this just a personal preference or opinion? No. The man who says that it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. What all this amounts to, then, is a moral argument for the existence of God. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. But objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. Atheism fails to provide a foundation for the moral reality every one of us experiences every day. In fact, the existence of objective morality points us directly to the existence of God.
All right. So that's the basic understanding we'll dive into as well, the Euthyphro Dilemma. So the options then, like I said, if someone's going to disagree with this, then they have to argue against the premises. And the first way then to argue against those premises is to just say there isn't objective moral values. And so this is embracing what we call moral relativism. So we could say that this is the belief that morals are the result of culture, and because of this are relative to the culture one is in. There's different versions of this. Some people might make moral relativism even more individualistic than just a culture that you're raised in. But what I've found is most people that are going to come across with this view are going to at least say that it's the culture that you live in, because they understand, well, if you just have one person that just says, well, my view is that I should kill as many people in my lifetime, they're going to look at that and say, well, obviously that doesn't make sense. The culture itself has at least said that that's wrong, and so therefore it must be wrong because of that. So we'll really just look at a little bit of the stronger case that somebody's going to make for more moral relativism by looking at this kind of society-bred moral relativism. So here's the problem, though. Where do morals come from? We've decided that killing others is bad because it hurts the survival of human beings as a species. That's why society is looking at it and saying, hey, if your goal, even if you as an individual have decided your goal is to kill as many people as you can in your lifetime, society has looked at that and said, that's not for the benefit of our society. It's not going to help us thrive, and therefore we're rejecting it. And regardless of whether you accept that or not, that is objectively what should happen in this society. So that's how they're going to say morals come from, or where they come from. The evidences that they're going to give for that is that cultures have clear differences on how they define right and wrong. Therefore, morals must be relative to cultures. So we look out and we see in different cultures that they have different traditions. You might look at in the Middle East, in very strict Muslim countries, they're going to say that a woman should dress extremely modestly, maybe even complete covering. The only things that you can see are her eyes. Where here in the US, when you go to a newsstand, you're going to see these magazines of very scantily clad women, and it's going to say that that's women's empowerment. You're giving women power, and that they're now able to live the lives that they want to, where it's suppressive looking at the Muslim countries. And so those differences show that really culture is defining morality differently. And so because they're defining it differently, then morality itself must be subjective instead of objective. Here's the problems with that idea. First of all, the first issue we have with that is, how do you ultimately define culture then? Because I live in a culture of Fort Collins. I live in the United States, but I'm also a part of a church culture. I'm part of a culture within my friend group, within my work group. And those different cultures, those different groups are going to disagree on what should be done in different situations. And so which one do I ultimately decide between? Someone who maybe has dual citizenship. Now, is that person inclined to live one culture when they're in one country and a different culture when they live in another? Or when someone who isn't a dual citizen comes and visits a country that they're not a citizen of, shouldn't they be able to live the culture that they're raised in? Because that's the culture they're a part of. They're just visiting this one. Which culture should they follow? If they're raised in a culture that says, hey, your job is to convince everybody that you can to move to our country, and if they don't agree with you, to move to our country, you should kill them. And they go and they visit the US or some other country, and that's what they're going about. But obviously in the US, we're like, that's not okay. Which one do you side with? Because cultures clash, they overlap. Which one do you ultimately decide between? If it's defined by culture, if it's defined by society, you need something that now is telling you which one you should choose between. And if there's something that's telling you what you should choose between, what you're then saying is, when you compare these two different societies, one is closer to a standard of what morality should be than the other. And once you've said that there's one that's closer to a standard of what objective morality should be, you've agreed that objective morality exists, and therefore morality is no longer subjective. That's problem number one. So each of us have different cultures. If culture determines what's right and not wrong, our cultures cannot be the thing telling us which culture to follow. This is kind of a way to think of this is even going back to the idea of music. Certain notes at certain times are the right notes to play. But when we look at music, when we look at sheets that are laid out for us of music sheets and notes, we understand that which notes are the right ones to play at the time. And one of those notes can itself be the music. So you have to have something beyond it, and that standard of the music sheets would then be our objective morality. You also have a problem because you cannot say one culture is better than another. This is part of what I started to even hint at a little bit, but even just looking at it and saying, well, we have the values of an Islamic country that is extremist Islamic, that's saying you should be covered from head to toe, and you have our country. And as we're in the US, we would look at it and we would say that those who are living in an Islamic country like that, the women are being suppressed. Well, you can't say that that's morally wrong. You could say that you don't like it and they do things differently than you, but it would be a subjective truth. Each of us is part of and so that ends up being another issue. Sorry, I lost track of my slides here. You also can't say that there's been improvement at all. So improvement implies that you're getting closer to a standard. When we look at the US, we still see that there's a problem with racism in the United States, but we could at least say, well, it's better than it was when we had slavery here. But if morality is only defined by the culture that you're in, we can't really say that we've improved. We can say that it's different than it once was. And we like this more. And so that's the culture that we're in. We cannot say that it's moved forward in any sort of way. And this also causes even bigger problem when we're looking at improvements, when we look at times in history that we would say people came along that we would call like moral gurus. Somebody like Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King. The society that they're in, that then they went about trying to change, was against the viewpoints of morality that they had. And so therefore, Martin Luther King would not be a good moral person in the society he was in. He would actually be a morally objectionable person. He would only be viewed as a good person in our society. But when we go back in time, if we went back in time, we would have to say that in the 50s, 60s, when he was doing things, that he was morally wrong. And I think we all intuitively understand that just doesn't make sense. Any thoughts or questions at this point? Cool. All right.
Now, that's an interesting value judgment that you're making. And I'd like to know, on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, on what basis can you make that value judgment between these two separate societies and cultures?
Why do I think a society is better that doesn't have slaves?
Yes, why is our set of values which abhor slavery superior to any other cultures which adheres to slavery? Why characterize this as a moral improvement rather than just a difference?
Well, it certainly is a difference, and the reason I think it's a moral improvement is that all of us have things to offer And slavery denies large numbers of people the chance to achieve everything that they have to offer to us. And I happen to think we live in a pluralistic society. And the essence of our society is that everyone gets a chance to contribute. Everyone gets the chance to throw
but that
out their
wasn't the
ideas.
essence of ancient Hebrew
and,
society, right? I mean,
Oh no.
so why are you imposing our values on them?
Oh, I'm not criticizing them for having slaves. That's their society, and that was where, you know. But the point I'm making is that there's no place where it's written in stone. Here are the moral values by which we should all live for all time.
So you can't really condemn slavery on an atheistic, naturalistic worldview, can you?
That's right.
No, I do. I do. I think slavery is wrong. I think it's a bad thing.
But isn't that just an expression of your own socio-cultural situation that you were born
right.
in this?
That's right.
So it doesn't have any objective sort of validity.
No, it comes from our society. That's why I said that
Okay.
all of us, I'll give you an example. Right today, we are arguing about whether or not it is moral for the president to have lied about his sexual relations. We're arguing about that. Is that a moral thing or not? We ourselves, all of us today, the senators, all of us who are voters, we are deciding whether what he did was a moral thing or not. And that's the way morals are created. In fact, I would say, and I would say, if you believe that you have some set of objective moral values, I would say, well, why should I believe that you have them? I mean, how are you going to know? Well, you're going to have to do the same thing as anybody else who has relative moral values to try to show why your values are better and right and they work correctly and they have this, all of those things. You have to go. You can't tell the difference between absolute objective values and relative ones. It's just a fact.
You don't think that you can tell that we ought to love a child rather than torture and sexually abuse a child?
I think that's a good idea to love a child. I think it's a good idea. It arises from our biological heritage. It's natural and normal for us.
But one isn't morally different from the other?
No, I think it's that they're morally different. It's bad to inflict harm. That's why I criticize God in the book of Job. He has inflicted unmerited, undeserved suffering on totally.
So hopefully there you can kind of see how he's bouncing forth between, he's making value judgments. He's making moral judgments on societies that have agreed in their society. Mainly he's criticizing biblical morals and different things that happened and saying that they were wrong for what they did, even though those societies maybe agreed that those things were okay. And he can't do that unless he's appealing to some sort of objective morality. Another thing to kind of clarify with this, and we talked about it a little bit already, kind of going back, this is kind of illustrating once again, you have one culture, our culture, that's going to like look at a woman walking around in her bikini and say that's women's empowerment. And then another culture that's going to say that that's to dress up, to have everything covered by your eyes. That's actually honoring and it's empowering women. It's making sure that they're protected by living in that sort of culture. So when we look at this, one of the things that we can see is there are some things, despite that there's disagreements on something maybe like this, that societies agree on across the board. We would all say that it's universally wrong to kill innocent human beings. It's wrong to kill or to torture innocent human beings. To put it really plainly, we would say that there's no culture that would ever say it's okay to torture babies for fun. No culture is ever going to agree with that. So there is an objective thing just when we look at that. Somebody might bring up, for example, well, we don't go killing people that are witches anymore. And so that shows that society has changed. We've changed our view regarding moral issues. Well, the reason that we don't really do that anymore isn't because we've changed our values. It's because we've changed our beliefs in something else, not moral things. If we really believed that there was witches out there cursing people, condemning them to hell or whatever else like that, we would probably say, hey, those are people that are worthy for the death sentence. but we just simply don't believe in that anymore. So it's not that morality has changed. It's we've changed and looking at witches to say witches just don't exist. And so our morality didn't change. Nazis justified what they did because they said Jews are subhuman. There wasn't a change in morality even going on with Nazis. It was ultimately saying Jews aren't human. Gays aren't human. Different things like that. It wasn't saying that it's okay to kill human beings. It was these are not human beings anymore. And that's what was changing. Even when we talk about abortion, the different views, ultimately, when it comes to the two things that we're looking at, pro-choice or pro-life, it's not that there's agreement that one's saying it's okay to kill a human being. What ultimately it comes down to is the pro-choice side is saying it is okay to kill a baby in the womb because it's not really a baby. It's not really a human being. So if we can show them, we'll talk about abortion another time, if we can show them that it is a human being, then the conversation really ends at that point. That's ultimately where all of this kind of goes to. So with the atheist, what we're left with ultimately is what Richard Dawkins says. And he said, the universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. This is ultimately, if atheism is true, if God does not exist, when it comes to any moral standard, there is none. We have no reason to look back and say that there is anything going on there. So someone might make a little bit more of the case here from atheistic standard and say moral values do exist, but God is not needed to give that. And this is what they might say. And we're actually going to watch some examples of this. We must care about well-being, is what an atheist might say. And so we're going to look at one atheist here. This is Matt Dillahunty. And he's one of the internet atheists that you're going to find. You're going to come across if you're doing searches and kind of hearing the atheist standard. And he's on what's called the Atheist Experience. It's a radio show and people call in. And I don't know if the caller ends up calling in that's a Christian or not, but he presents the moral argument. And this is how Matt responds. And to me, this shows, so we're going to look at him. We're also going to look at Christopher Hitchens. And we're going to see how even the best atheists either don't understand the argument or their argument or reply to it just doesn't hold up very well.
So we got David, the first caller from, is it Grand Blanc? Michigan?
Grand Blanc.
Grand Blanc.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, how you doing?
Hey,
I'm a proponent of William Lane Craig's moral argument, and I have a couple of questions about some of the objections you've had with that argument in the past.
Okay.
So, as I understand it, you are a moral realist, correct?
What's that?
From what I understand, you are a moral realist, right? You
It would
accept
be-
premise 2 of the argument.
Well, it depends on what, so you better give the argument so that it's clear that, and we're not just talking to each other in code while nobody else gets to hear anything.
Okay, well, premise 1 is if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist.
Yeah, I reject the first premise.
Objective moral values and duties do exist, and then the conclusion is that God exists.
Yeah, I reject the first premise.
Okay, and from what I understand, and correct me if I'm misrepresenting you, but in the past you've said that moral values are right and wrong depending on how they affect the well-being of people.
So, yeah, when I'm talking about morality, I tend to be talking about well-being. If that's not what somebody else is talking about, then we'd need a different word. But that to me seems to be the evaluation that we're making. And that because we're physical beings in a physical universe, there are truths to be discovered about the consequences of our actions, but they are entirely situational.
Okay, well, then my question would be, what is truly wrong with negatively affecting the well-being of people on an atheistic worldview? If we are just a blind product of time plus matter plus chance, what inherent moral worth do we have?
We have moral worth to ourselves. That's what matters.
Is that not completely subjective though?
Yeah.
So how?
So he just admits there his foundation itself is subjective. Well-being is the reason that we should be morally objective, and whether or not we should care about well-being is something that's entirely subjective. And so ultimately, if your foundation for giving morally objective truths is itself subjective, then you don't have objective moral truths anymore. Another argument that I've heard that I think is a good reply to it, because a lot of people, a lot of atheists that want to promote this idea that objective moral truths can exist without God, is they're going to say well-being or the thriving of humanity or different things like that. And the question has to be, why does that matter? Why does the thriving of humanity matter objectively? Because I don't think the atheist has any reason to say that the thriving of humanity matters. Because ultimately, we're just the result of an evolutionary process. We might be the highest species in that process, but that doesn't mean that we're more valuable than the other species that exist on the earth. And a lot of people could make a strong argument. And what's interesting is a lot of atheists probably do actually make the argument when they're not talking about philosophy and ethics, that ultimately humankind is actually hurting society or hurting Earth more than helping it. And so from a moral standpoint, you could even make the case that really the best thing for the Earth, for the universe even, is for the end of humanity. And so now you can't even say that I should do my best to keep someone from murdering someone else, because that's helping to end humanity. And that's really what should be happening, because humanity is causing problems to Earth, all the environmental damages that we're causing. And ultimately, then we should want society to die. And that obviously, once again, goes against our intuitions when it comes to things. So we're going to also watch, this is Christopher Hitchens, and listen to a little bit of him kind of talking about some of this as well. Let's skip ahead a little bit.
If Christopher Hitchens does not believe in God, reviewers have asked, then where does he get his sense of right and wrong? You have replied in print that this question is in itself insulting, and you have rejected, quote, the appalling insinuation that I would not know right from wrong if I was not supernaturally guided, close quote. What?
All right. So this is what he says in his book. He's going to even give this. And this is what we clarified at the very beginning. As we give this argument, we're not saying that atheists cannot be moral. And this is where Hitchens is out of his league. He's out of his area of expertise. He's not understanding the philosophy, and he's replying to an argument that's not being made. He's saying that I can be moral, even though I don't believe in God. That's never been our argument.
Insulting.
Because I think it's degrading to the human, to us, to you and me, to imply, well, not to imply, to state directly that absent a celestial dictatorship that had some supernatural influence over us, yet to be established, by the way, as anything really existent, but without the assumption of it, we wouldn't know right from wrong. We wouldn't return stolen property if we found it in the back of a cab. We wouldn't give blood if someone badly needed a transfusion, unless we were afraid either of punishment or desirous of a reward. That we might help ourselves to underage children, as some religious people have actually been known to do. Because after all, what's stopping us? Now, you could tell me if you wanted, that you would do all those things if you weren't God-fearing. But I would choose not to believe you. I have more respect for you, if not for your opinions, than that.
All right, Jonathan Swift. Not just reviewers of your book, but Jonathan Swift is at least aware of this argument. He has an essay in which he has a country yokel listening to the arguments of an atheist and then declaring, quote, "Why, sir, if it be as you say, I can drink and whore and defy the parson."
So far, so good.
Close quote. But if there is no God, if there is no objective ground of right and wrong, from what do you derive your morals? From what do you derive right and wrong?
The stupidest person in Smerdyakov, I think it is, in the Brothers Karamazov says, but he turns out himself to be a very moral person. He says, but without God, wouldn't everything be permitted? That's the sense of what he said.
Right.
By the way, I think some people who say this may fear it to be true of themselves. I mean, some people who are psycho or sociopathic may conceivably have this view that only superstition restrains them from cruelty, theft, rapine, violence, utter selfishness, and so forth. But I don't believe it's true. First, I think our knowledge of the right and wrong is innate in us. Religion gets its morality from humans. We know that we can't get along if we commit perjury, theft, murder, rape. All societies at all times, well before the advent of monotheism, certain things, have forbidden it.
If morality, a sense of morality, is another adaptive or evolved faculty, the problem is that there are all kinds of things that we're stuck with as a result of evolution, if one posits evolution. So you feel biological.
All right, so we'll move on. But you can see from there, his objection to this is to say, well, I can still be moral without believing in God. And even to take it further in classic Hitchens style, to make it an emotional appeal to say, like, if really the only reason you're being moral is because you believe in a God up in the sky, then like you're a horrible person, is basically what he's getting at. And that's just typical Hitchens' way of going about it. He appeals to your emotion, but it's not actually answering or even talking about the argument at all. So one of the better, though, replies, and one of the things that we have to talk about, the video mentioned, is the Euthyphro Dilemma. So what this puts out, it's from Plato's Dialogues, and he's dialoguing with a guy named Euthyphro. And basically what Euthyphro throws out is, it seems like you're left with a choice if you believe that morals come from God, that either God commands it because he's good. Does God command it because he's good? Or are things good because God commands it? And the problem with each of these is if he does command it because it's good, then morality doesn't need God. Because if God's looking outside of himself and saying, oh, these are good things, I'm going to tell people to do those things, then let's just cut out the middleman. We don't need God in order to get morality. So that's obviously not an option for the Christian or any theist. And then the other option is to say that things are good simply because God commands it. But this makes things arbitrary. God said, don't kill people, but he also could have said, if you wanted, kill people. And that would have been the way things should be. So both of these ends up being a problem. But what we all ultimately see is all Christian philosophers, when they look at this, they ultimately say, this is what we call a false dilemma. Someone's trying to say either the Patriots are the best team in the NFL or the Broncos are. There's other options. And so that's what we're going to say with this, that yes, both of these unacceptable. We cannot take those from a Christian perspective, from a theistic perspective. And that, again, let me even mention what we're doing here, giving the moral argument here, we're not getting to a Christian God. All we're getting to is there is a God. And if there is a God, now we're going to start talking about what are the reasons we can believe which God it is. But as a theist, then, either of these options aren't viable. These aren't ones that we can take. So what we end up saying is God commands things because he is good. So he's not looking out there and saying, oh, I'm going to arbitrarily, or I'm not going to arbitrarily, I'm going to see the good out here and I'm going to choose to assign that to humankind. Therefore, he's not needed. And he's also not just like willy-nilly, we'll go with that one here, we'll go with that one over here. He's ultimately saying, this is who I am, and I'm going to tell humankind to act in that way. And so that's how we get away from the problem, is say there's a different option that hasn't been put on the table with the Euthyphro Dilemma. So some last thoughts with all of this that I think are just helpful to kind of keep in mind. And I even wanted to show C.S. Lewis kind of explaining this whole argument a bit, because C.S. Lewis, this was a huge reason that C.S. Lewis came to the Lord, is because ultimately a huge reason that he rejected God growing up is because he looked at it and said, there seems to be morally objective or morally objectionable things that are happening in the world. And I can't believe in a God that would allow those things to happen. But then he had a realization, oh, the only way I can say that those things are wrong, the things that I'm saying that prove that God doesn't exist are actually wrong, is if God does exist. Because the only way that those things are objectively objectionable is if God exists. And so he realized God must exist. So when we're talking about all this, and I should have made these bigger, I realize they're way too small for you guys to see. We intuitively believe that there's a moral oughtness or ought notness to different situations. You shouldn't do this, you should do that. And that's different to say when we're looking at morality, there's a difference between bad and good and right and wrong. Those are not equal when we're talking about morality, because I can look at it and say, it would be good for me to become a doctor. It would be good for me to become president or become whatever else. Maybe some people debate that as far as me being the president. That probably actually wouldn't be great. Anyways, but there's a lot of different things that I could do as an occupation that are good for me to do, but that doesn't mean that those things are the right things. So being good doesn't necessarily mean it's right. It's not something that I ought to do. There's no oughtness to me becoming a doctor. It'd be good, but there's no moral inclination. There's no moral duty to do those things. We can believe in morally subjective until something personal goes against that belief. So this is another reason that I like this argument, is because when we're in conversation with people, very rare are you going to meet anyone who doesn't have something that they look at and say, this is something that is wrong and it's objectively wrong. I don't care what you think. I've even been thinking next time I may be getting into a discussion with someone who's even on the pro-choice side, I might, instead of talking really about abortion, to switch that conversation and say, hey, you're saying that it's wrong. It is completely objectively wrong to tell a woman what she can and can't do with her body. That's what you're claiming. And if that's true, then moral objections exist. And the only way that the moral objectives exist is if God exists, and kind of use that to shift the conversation to what's a much more central and important issue than abortion, even though that's a very important issue. But instead, let's look at it and say, hey, this actually shows us God exists. I don't even agree with you on the idea that we shouldn't be able to tell a woman what she can and can't do with her body when it comes to abortion. I don't even agree with you, but your sense of saying that is an agreement that those things are morally true and that moral objective things do exist. So you have pro-choice things. Spiritual people believe that a religion is personal, aka subjective, but forcing your morality on others is wrong. So you can believe whatever you want spiritually, religiously, but it is wrong, is objectively wrong to force your religious views on someone else. Well, that seems to point to there must be a God that exists, because that's the only way you can have a foundation for that. Extremely liberal campuses are going to believe that you have the right to express your subjective view unless that view is considered hateful, prejudice, or some other label to them. So they might say that's some sort of microaggression or whatever else like that. And so you can't say or do those things because it's morally, objectively wrong. And those sort of things are things that we can appeal to. Tolerance in general. Well, you have to be tolerant of other people. And those are things that we can point out to people to use this argument to then shift it to say, well, let's talk about God. because ultimately what you're telling me when you're saying that I'm wrong to do this or that is that there is an objective moral code. And the only way that that can exist is if God exists. And that's why I think this is really important. So we all understand there's moral oughts and not nots. And then just a last thing with that, and then we'll watch C.S. Lewis kind of explaining this in these kind of doodle videos that are really cool. Some people might appeal to it and say, well, nature itself, we can look at and we can see that animals themselves believe in right and wrong or do moral things. They help their others. They even help maybe even a different species, or at least they help the herd, the people or the animals within their herd. And so therefore they're moral things. But that doesn't make sense to just appeal to that, because we see other things that we would say those are morally objectionable. Black widow kills its mate every time it mates. And so would we say, okay, that's okay. Then every time somebody, a woman has sex with a guy, he can kill him. That's fine. Nature does it. We're not going to look at nature to come up with our moral choices, because we see all sorts of things that happen within society. Just because nature does it doesn't mean that it's right or wrong. All right. So lastly, we'll watch these doodle videos that kind of explain this really well, if it works. Or maybe we'll stop there. It's coming. Or it's not. Try one more time. And we'll just finish with that. Those are pretty long, actually. Okay, there it is. We could watch it afterwards. I'll cut the live feed off, and then we can just pull it up that way. So there you guys go. End the stream.